afternoon, everybody. My name is Lorena. I'm from Michigan State University and part of the ARIS leadership team meeting, and I want to welcome you to this session of the ARIS Summit. We have this very esteemed panel, very excited to hear from everyone on pathways and programs to support public engagement by scientists. Because we have a large panel, I'm going to let them introduce themselves. At the end, we will be having questions. We'll have time for questions, and you can put your questions either in the chat or we'll be able to do raised hands, and I'll call on you going forward, or somebody on the panel will. As you can see, there is recording on, so if you're willing to accept that, go ahead. And otherwise, take it away, everybody.
Great. Thank you so much, Lori. Hi, everyone. I'm Alana Kimbrell with the American Association for the Advancement of Science Center for Public Engagement with Science and Technology. I'm here with my co-host, Kristen Lewis, and a number of other people who will be participating, but we'll turn to them in a moment. This will not be a kind of typical panel presentations. We're going to have more of a dialogue with just a couple of slides as overviews. So I will start out by just setting the stage for the session. So the AAAS Center for Public Engagement with Science and Technology provides a range of different kinds of support for scientists and engineers doing engagement work. And so in this session, we wanted to share some of these approaches, including the perspectives of participants in the programs, and have a discussion with them and you all about what kinds of support scientists need, what makes useful and successful programs, and talk about the challenges of doing these at different kinds of institutions. So we're talking today about our specifically fellowship or cohort-based programs in particular, but our center also does a number of other different kinds of things. So I wanted to just very quickly share our approach to supporting scientists. I'm going to just talk through the kind of pillars of support or buckets that you can see here to give you a sense of how we think about this work that we're doing. And I really want to hear from you all as well and get your input on all of this. So as we said before, feel free right now to chime in with questions or comments in the chat, and later we'll have time for full group conversation. So at the center, we provide training for scientists and engineers in public engagement. And so for that, our primary method is through our communicating science workshops. We also have what we call launchpad programs. So those are training plus opportunities to actually do and practice engagement. And so those include two programs we'll talk about today, the Mass Media Fellowship and our If Then Ambassador program. Then we also have what we call capacity building work. So that's includes training and practice, but also thinking about ways to really build public engagement into the long-term careers and identities of scientists and into their institutions. So thinking about ways to build capacity at the individual and institutional level. And then we have our demonstration projects or work. So that's kind of showing different kinds of examples of public engagement in action, whether we are facilitating that or showcasing what others are doing. And then we do, collaboration and networking work to try to, in particular, build bridges between research in science communication and engagement and the practice of it. So that's kind of the overview. We see all this as working together to fill different kinds of needs and challenges. And we are interested in sharing, models for institutionalizing this kind of support for public engagement in other places and as well. So again, as I said, if you see things here or you don't see things here that you are interested in, or you've seen something work somewhere or are working on something that is different from what you're seeing here, we want to hear about that as well and get your feedback today. So today, we're going to do some short intros of each program and hear from program participants briefly about their experience. And we'll have a conversation then across all of the programs for a bit and turn to questions and discussion from you all. So first, though, I wanted to just hear from you all quickly. So if you could go to slido.com and enter the event code 5162281, or I will put the link in the chat you can just click on to hear from you all about your role in connection with science engagement. And so please try to keep that to just a couple of words. And if you want to have more than one response, feel free to enter more than one response. Facilitation so far, it's a big one. Great. Grant development, coaching, training, proposal development. Got grant development in there a couple times. Educator, consultant, writer, editor, professional development. All right, great. Thank you all so much. And I am going to move us along. I have just one more question for you. So again, try to keep this to a couple of words. What do you hope to take away from this session, or what brought you to this session? What are you interested in? What other organizations are doing? Inspiration. Understand resources that are out there, perhaps. Community collaboration, best practices. Great. What others are doing, gain more knowledge. Okay. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to leave that open. I also realized we also have recently put out a paper in Frontiers in Communication that dives into some of our programs and the way we think about institutional support and inclusive engagement. So in case folks are interested, I wanted to share that link in the chat as well, because it kind of takes a deeper dive into some of what we're talking about today. So that's in the chat link as well. So now I'm going to turn it over to Kristen to take us into our conversation portion with our program participants.
Thank you so much, Alana. Hi, everyone. I am Kristen Lewis, and I am the director of the AAAS Mass Media Fellowship. This is a program that takes science grad students, undergrads, postdocs, and gives them an opportunity to spend 10 weeks as a science journalist working for an outlet like NPR or the Wichita Eagle, a wide variety of outlets all across the country. This is a paid fellowship program, which is a fantastic opportunity for science students to really get that firsthand experience and see if science communication or science journalism is a pathway that they want to pursue at the end of their scientific training, or see if they can incorporate it into their scientific career. I am here with Lorena Villanueva-Almanza, and I'll let her introduce herself.
Thanks, Kristen, and thank you, Alana. I am Lorena Villanueva-Almanza. I'm originally from Mexico City. And as Kristen just mentioned, I was part of the AAAS Mass Media Fellowship in 2020. I had completed my PhD in plant biology at the University of California, Riverside. And so I was still exploring science communication avenues and had already participated in ComSciCon. And I was looking for more experience on this. And so a friend of mine recommended applying to this program. And when I saw it, I thought it was just fantastic because of the types of support that they give, which of course include the stipend. In my case, I was funded by the Association of Plant Biologists, which was great. And it's not only that financial support, it's also the time that you get to spend in the newsroom that was really very engaging and very different to the other workshop that I had attended. You get to work with reporters and editors that give a completely new perspective to the stories that I was working on. So I think that is very unique, and this is probably the story that I'm most proud of because it was printed. I'm seeing that it doesn't really come out, but it's a story about bats because even when I was at the newsroom virtually, I was able to travel to Indianapolis and work on this piece with scientists on the ground and just like take a photographer with me, ask all sorts of questions, and then just realize that the questions that I would ask as a scientist are very different to the questions that the photo reporter was asking. So yeah, it was a fantastic summer for sure.
Thank you, Lorena. I just put a link to that article in the chat as well. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you found unique about this program? You know, particularly you mentioned CompSciComm. How did that differ, and what?
Yeah. Well, CompSciComm is great. It also served as an inspiration to me as a graduate student to start a science communication group at my university because it's led by students. But compared to that, of course, being organized by the AAAS, you have this whole infrastructure that supports you. And so in our case, even when it was virtual, I felt very connected to the rest of my colleagues because one of the things that I really appreciate is Kristen sent us books, and those books just made me feel very connected to the rest of the fellows. We were discussing in small groups what the stories that we really liked were. So now I'm just like showing you, it's one of the books that I really like, and now I have a full collection. So just growing that community, bouncing off ideas of what we liked and what we didn't like for this particular series was fantastic. We were also included in this Slack group, and everybody gave kudos and shout out to everybody else's work, and the sharing that also made me feel part of a cohort. Specifically to me, what made it very unique, and I don't know if there are other programs that actually do this, is the fact that there were other Spanish speakers in my cohort, and that allowed me to feel very connected to them. And these are people that I still like Slack or message or even call on the phone. And the other part of that also goes to mentoring. So I think it was the first year, and please correct me if I'm wrong, Kristen, in which this fellowship incorporated a mentor group that started right after the fellowship ended. And we were paired with a mentor with whom we were working on career goals. And so for me, it was freelancing for outlets, both in Mexico and in the US. And the person that I was paired up with, I'm still in touch with him, and he's also from Mexico. So we were able to meet in Mexico City and just have coffee and talk about all sorts of things related to both the AAAS Mass Media Fellowship and the mentorship program, but also ideas moving forward, both in Mexico and in the US. So I would say that it's a program that crosses boundaries, and it's very unique in that sense because CompSciComm still doesn't do that. And yeah, it's a real world experience for sure. And it allowed me also to step out of the plant world. I do love plants, but I needed to work on different stories.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. We will have a chance to talk a little bit more, but in the meantime, I will pass it along to Chris to introduce our next program.
Thank you, Kristen, and fitting because you're a huge part of this program. So my name is Chris Symons, and I have the great fortune of working with Lyda Philanthropies as part of one of her initiatives, which is the AAAS If Then Ambassador Program. And Kristen, of course, representing AAAS. So a tiny bit of background on Lyda Hill, our benefactor. Her goal in life is to solve the world's problems with science. She believes that science is the solution. And in doing this over the last decades of funding science, her observation was that those who are solving those problems don't well represent our population. So her objective in the If Then initiative was to empower and elevate women STEM innovators and to equip them so that they can tell their stories and their unique stories, because they're all very unique. They cross different disciplines and are from different places. They all hold different roles. They range from academics to entrepreneurs. Some work for nonprofits, some for large corporations. So there were 125 ambassadors selected for this program 2.5 years ago. And I have the great fortune of here being accompanied by Nicole Jackson, who will tell you more from the ambassador perspective. But the idea was they came together once in a summit and were provided professional development and some of the public engagement skills, thanks to AAAS, that they've done so well. And the sort of ask, I suppose you would say, is that they turn around and role model and mentor young people and inspire young girls to follow their paths and to pursue or consider pursuing a career in STEM. It also included a possibility of a grant, a $10,000 grant. They didn't have to apply for it, some did, and produced amazing projects. And I think I'm going to let Nicole Jackson introduce herself now, because she can speak to the experience of having been an ambassador.
Sure. Thank you. So my name is Nicole Jackson. I'm the head of products for a company called Nurse Dash, and became an ambassador back in 2019 before COVID did a thing that we're all keenly aware of. And, I think that the main part in speaking to the ambassadorship is it actually kicked off right before COVID. And so it really did transition what our initial thought and ideation was, or what the program was going to be, to what it had to become. And so a big part of, the program itself was about us learning how to engage in a more virtualized world with the students that we were interacting with, using different platforms and different methods to communicate to students at scale in some instances, through really strategic partnerships that, Lyda, Hill, and IFTHN had initially identified along with AAAS. One is NEPRIS, for example. It's an online platform that allows us to connect directly to classrooms, except when we launched, kids weren't in classrooms and they weren't, they were home. So we found ourselves doing like homework assignments with like 6 and 7 year olds and going through this like whole different transition. And so kind of tacking on what like Lorena talked about a bit ago, which was pretty incredible, which is the power of things like Slack and supporting ourselves. Not only in the middle of engaging our students, but also engaging each other, speaking specifically to the importance of a lot of that role. We had a lot of other things happen in 2020, which I think we shouldn't lose sight of either, which is George Floyd and protests and everything else. And we were able to really focus and hone in on our collective communities, and to really scale up the idea, not only for what it means to be mentors for the students that we wanted to affect, but also be mentors to one another and be support systems to one another. So.
And we're familiar with all the professional societies and discipline-specific organizations that many of the ambassadors, yourself included, are affiliated. What was unique about the IFTHN program in your experience from which you benefited?
Yeah, I think the most striking piece was, so going back to the summit that you initially mentioned, when we arrived, there was 125 other women that we did not know, that were in all different disciplines, and there was like zero competition. We were actually intrigued and kind of fangirled each other, like, oh, I've literally never heard of that. That's a job. You dive in the ocean and you look for Amelia Earhart. That's a job. That's a thing. So that process is kind of the thing that started. But in there, you kind of touched on it. We were given professional development, understanding our impact in social media, understanding how we would communicate to, the cohorts of students. They brought in individuals that were in that age range that we were targeting. So we realized very quickly, like, how we communicate to one another is not necessarily how we communicate to this audience. And it helped us really position our messaging and understand how to really target those messages. But amongst everything is this idea that there's just these women that we're profoundly like inspired by. And it created a different like sub community of support. I can go on and on about like 75 million examples, but a big one is I was transitioning into an organization or out of an organization, and I need to talk to someone who had been through the process of, equity with a startup before. We just happen to have 2 or 3 women who do that. And so we were like peer mentoring and peer coaching each other through like, how should I negotiate? How should I do these things? Mm-hmm. At the same time, where I'm like being mentored by others to say, I have a student who's experiencing this. I may not know anything about this, but can you help me on how I would communicate with the student? Mm-hmm. And so it's the peer mentoring and also the traditional mentoring that was significantly impactful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I would say a side note to that too, is one of the conversations I remember listening to was just with respect to compensation, stipend, speaking engagements, and what do I ask for? And, And, what's a baseline? And it's the things that we don't always speak about, but are an absolute necessity when you're invited to spend your time, your professional time, speaking to audiences. I'm curious too what your perception. I referenced the mini grants that were a $10,000 award to those who were interested, and there've been some amazing outcomes from those, ranging from comic books to trading cards to implementing mentor programs in local community K-12 schools. Can you comment on the mini grants or any of those that you're familiar with?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. They scaled. So there's two things. I remember when the mini grant came out, and the coolest thing is we were all like submitting our mini grants and then concurrently asking other people to help with the mini grants we were submitting. So it's like, hey, not only should you help me review this mini grant, also, would you like to participate in this mini grant? And even after they were approved, many of us still participated in each other's programs. My personal mini grant focus with the project with Women in Science and Wikipedia and creating, content. And I wanted to make sure I brought up some stats just to kind of look at the continued impact. $10,000 goes a long way with, 554 edits and 2.4 million views and counting. We added 19,000 words from 20 different contributors. And that framework was then used to create other grants very similar to it and other different topics similar to it with Women in Science and others, so that they understood the framework by which they could communicate. So something like that kind of goes in perpetuity. But when you look at programs like trading cards, I have some of these women's trading cards, and they're very cool because, kids get to see themselves. They get to see people who have interests, who look like them, who express like them. And that's a really big deal.
Yeah. Agreed. Yeah. Thank you. And you can tell all of us could go on forever. So I think I'll stop there and pass back to Elana.
Okay, just had to unmute there. Thank you so much. So now Jen and I are going to talk a little bit about the AAAS Leshner Public Engagement Fellowship Program. So this started in 2016. It's had 5 cohorts, each with between 10 and 15 active researchers. We have historically had these be mid-career-ish researchers, and each cohort focused on a general topic area so that the scientists came from different disciplines, but their work did overlap in some way. So climate change, infectious disease, food and water security, human augmentation, and AI. And so the fellows came to AAAS for training and orientation and practice doing different kinds of engagement, and then would go back to their home institutions for the year with a public engagement and institutional change plan that we worked with them on to try to kind of be more strategic and level up their public engagement work and the work they're doing to help support their colleagues and students in doing more public engagement. And we also had a recent evaluation of the program. And so I will share that in case anyone's interested in taking a look at what we did with the evaluation. Right here in the chat, sorry. And and I want to turn now to Jen, who is one of our Leshner Fellows, to introduce herself.
Right. Thank you, Alana. My name is Jen Montclare, Jen Kim Montclare. I'm a professor here at NYU in the Chemical and Biomolecular Engineering Department. And I was a Leshner Fellow, the Human Augmentation cohort. And so I learned a lot about using, at least being trained in SciComm, specifically like social media and blogging and things that I may not have been trained at or know about, but learned in the process and expanded that within my home institution, as well as collaborated with my fellow Leshner fellows to write op-ed pieces, etc. So it was an interesting experience for me. And one of the important things is that I was able to have this network that I can rely on, but also learn a lot more than just science engagement, but also with policy, of which we went as a group to the Hill and learned, that we can actually engage with policymakers, which was kind of blew my mind, and how we can like make impact on the policies with respect to STEM, with respect to graduate students, et cetera. So that was eye-opening experience for me, and I'm grateful to have participated.
Great. And could you tell us just a little bit about kind of an activity that you worked on, whether that was public engagement or institutional capacity building during the fellowship?
Right. So I did a bit of both. For public engagement, I was interested in blogging. And so I actually started not only blogging myself, but so I run a lab and I have students. So having the students participate in blogging, also implementing that within the classes that I've taught as well. And so that was important, and trying to make that sustainable was something that was important for me, and continuously pushing blogs out or material out. On the other hand, because public engagement, at least I learned that public engagement is important, especially even now with vaccinations, with that COVID pandemic, misinformation. So with that, I was able to get my institution to support training for our women and underrepresented minority faculty on public engagement, where they can do, we had folks come in, train us in not specifically blogging or things like that, but on how to write an op-ed post and how to engage the public in that way. And so I was able to get at least institutionally my other faculty members the opportunity to do that as well. And so that happened actually during the pandemic, and it was all virtual. And then pieces came out of that as well. So those were the two prongs for me.
Great. Okay, and we'll dive more in with all of you and with some questions now. So thank you so much, Jen, and all of you for participating. And Kristen, can you kick off our conversation?
Certainly. Thank you so much to all of our panelists for giving that introduction. It's a quick overview of our programs. As you can imagine, there's a lot more to dive into in any particular topic. So as the audience, if you have questions, you can start to put them in the chat and or raise your hand, and we'll start it off with a few questions here. Now, each of these programs had an initial orientation or training, whether that was the summit from the IFTHEN ambassadors or the initial orientation weeks for the Leshner Leadership Institute or the Mass Media Fellows. I'm curious about your experience of that initial orientation. What was important about it? What was the most important aspect? Lorena, do you want to start us off there?
Yes, because I really enjoyed this part of the workshop. The summer. We had orientation given by David Grimm from Science Magazine online. And there were recordings, but I kept just taking like screenshots because it was so useful to me. I had attended the ComSciCon workshop, but nothing like this, because it took you step by step on this is something that you could do, what you could think about. Pitching ideas, which I found it to be really useful for a later part of my career, was just great because, yeah, you could have a great idea, but if you don't find the right people to interview or the right angle to your story, then it becomes really difficult both to sell the story to your editor later into the fellowship and then to the editor that you want to work for as a freelance writer. So that was really helpful for me, but I also took many of the resources and then adapted those as I became an editor myself of a blog, and then I use many of those resources still for my current job, which is project management. So all that training that was provided to us formally was fantastic, but also when I started working with the reporters at the Indie Star, it's that training that it's not a formal training, but you get all this feedback. And it was just so useful because all of those edits and even the method of how you edit a story with someone is just crucial for many of the things that I currently do now.
Thank you. Nicole or Jen, did you have anything to add on orientation or the summit?
Yeah, for for me, I kind of learned a lot all at once, it seemed. And even just Twitter accounts using LinkedIn, like this was not something that I grew up with, and I would, my students are far better at this than I am, and so understanding that and learning about that, and then also working together on pieces. So we would actively kind of say, okay, what type of piece would you like to write? And all of us would work on that. And fortunately together, a group of us, a subset of us actually wrote something together. And so I think all of the active training and then just being with one another, and also having the umbrella of human augmentation where we could understand each other's research. And I think that was super, super important, at least for me, and helped me kind of have more ownership and like part of the group, because all of us were in the same levels of careers and we had some science underlying our connection.
Well, and I think just adding on to everything that's been said, with 125 different women from 125 different backgrounds, it kind of gave us a baseline to say, well, who are we? We were given a lot of resources very early on for communication and everything else, but the thing that could not be recreated was the synergy from when we initially met. And we kind of carried that through for the past several years in our ambassadorship that really just created a bond that, like, I don't even know how to describe what it is, right? But we still talk a lot, and it's a community thing, and the orientation was the kickoff to create that community.
Great, thank you. So I want to turn to Chris. As you have been, a funder of the If Then program, how has your perspective changed through the experience of the program coming to fruition? And did outcomes kind of match expectations?
Yeah, sure. And I can speak to that from the perspective of my colleagues. I joined the program a little over a year ago. So it was underway and well underway, and it's sort of pivoting, adjusting to COVID. But I would say it exceeded our expectations tenfold to hundredsfold, both in the gratitude of the ambassadors. We had no idea that we were filling a gap that seemed to be present, and whether they knew that or not, or we didn't realize that they would gain so much from purely the networking alone. We were on our way to planning a second summit that we ultimately had to cancel because COVID spiked again last fall. And as we were trying to secure experts in professional development areas and public speaking and all these specifics, the feedback that we were hearing was we just want to be together and network and meet and talk and enjoy each other's company and learn from each other. And which was which was funny when you go from the straight, the focus on filling every minute of every day to they just really thrived, as I'm hearing from all of them, or most of it, that they thrived on the ability to support each other and to provide a lot of knowledge and experience to each other. So that was amazing. And beyond that, I mean, it's overwhelming. None of them had any kind of a responsibility per se to doing things, but they've just been so active in everything they've done. Nicole being one of the most prolific on this platform, she referenced NEPRIS, where she's speaking to classrooms who are wanting to learn about different careers. And I think for myself, I can say personally, I didn't appreciate until this last year the experience of other women in science. I was a scientist myself and looked at it as, oh, that's what it's like to be a woman in science. Well, it's not what it's like to be a Black woman in science, an Asian woman in science, an Indigenous woman in science. Like, I had no idea that I was generalizing to the disservice of respecting and appreciating the experience of others. So that was very eye-opening, and I hope that we've helped to try to move that needle. But there's a long way to go. But so I feel like I gained a tremendous amount in watching these incredible women work together and support each other and inspire young people, which is one of our goals.
Right.
That's
Great.
amazing.
Kristen, go ahead.
I just wanted to follow up on that. You all talked about the importance of this cohort and this network. So structurally, what did these programs do to help facilitate the building of those networks? And are there things that you think other programs could do differently to help recreate these types of cohort connections?
At least, at least for our cohort, I think it was helpful to have all of us there and present and interacting with one another and talking with one another about what we were writing about or about what we were doing in terms of public engagement, because they're the community. Like, we didn't know that this community existed until we started to work together and learn these, at least undergo training. And so kind of even just putting us together or, having a group I think was the most important part. Because one can say, oh, I want to do public engagement alone, but it's really hard, and having a cohort that you can rely on and then you can learn from, I think is an important part of this to be successful.
I think something that can be leveraged, if was really good about allowing us space to be who we were, whether or not, whatever intersectional identity we have, right? I think that was a big piece of it. We did not shy away from the fact that there's 20 plus Black women in this program that represent different areas of STEM. We embraced that. And as a result, we were able to really connect. Likewise, we embraced the fact that there were several of us who represented the LGBTQIA community, and we embraced that. And that was not a thing we shied away from. And so one thing I think that can significantly be leveraged in this lesson is allowing space for authenticity, allowing space for that individual growth as different cohorts kind of develop, and not trying to drive it, but allowing people to kind of self-identify and support that process, because it's really, really critical when we're trying to build up that sense of community. And then as we are developing together, there will be areas where we can intersect, and there are areas that are unique to our experiences. I think to Saturday shooting in the first place that I ran to for, a sense of support from the professional community was actually that Slack channel with those Black cohorts who uniquely understood what it meant when we were going to show up to work on Monday and try to navigate some of these conversations. And so that's why that's so critical, because it's still a thing that I'm using now.
And I guess that for me, even when Slack was really great, I still feel like it would be great to meet with the other fellows sometime in person, because as Nicole has mentioned, being in the same space together just allows for this conversation that you don't have planned, that is not in any agenda. And it's something that Jen also said before, it's just so spontaneous, and you just find that you're working on similar stories and similar angles in the same language even. So I feel like I missed that. However, I should say that the AAAS did a pretty good job at just navigating this virtual component of the fellowship. So yeah.
Thank you, Lorena.
Great, thank you all. And so could anyone share some way in which your public engagement or science communication work has sort of evolved or changed since the program?
At least for me, my goal was blogging, and I thought it was just me. But then I realized I can't sustain it because I'm a faculty member. I have to do all sorts of things. So I involved my students, and that was not intentional, from the beginning. And it was through this that it evolved into this. And so my students engage with the public by writing blogs about what it is to be a scientist, or what they like to do, not science, just to try to get the public engaged. And I find it super useful for them, as a training for them, because that they get to think about communications other than what they're doing as science, but then it also helps them when they're getting their degrees on being able to write and being able to communicate, which I find profoundly important. That is lacking in graduate education, but it has helping at least my students and the teams there. And I also see in the chat that there's someone who has asked about how to sell leadership. One thing is that then because of these blogs, because my students are now involved, it also helps with recruitment, right? So recruiting students, bright students who are interested in this and learning about this. So I think that's something that is an advantage and that you can probably sell to leadership on.
Yeah, to just sort of add, when I started, I mentored before it was then, so I should say that. But the combination of like COVID and, like I said, George Floyd and protests and everything just kind of became overwhelming. I had to do some like life evaluation at some point. I had to take a pause. And when I did, I realized, I'm probably not aligned with what I want to do for a living. I don't know if the things I'm doing are really social impact. And, everyone went through a thing in 2020. I absolutely went through a thing in 2020. And that thing kind of forced my hand in my career. So I made a decision to walk away from what I was doing. At the time, I was the chief technology officer. I decided to come into a head of product role, literally working in an area of social impact, because I was so struck by what like physicians and nurses were going through, what was actually happening in nursing homes, what was actually happening in real life. And I, at some point, had a hard time like feeling like I was being genuine when I was communicating with kids. I'm like, no, do the thing that makes your heart feel good. But then also I'm just kind of showing up to work every day. And so for me, like the biggest part of If Then was it forced me to really look in the mirror. It forced me to really ask myself if I was aligned with what I felt like I could, how I wanted to show up in the world every day. And I made some really drastic changes in my professional career and made some changes based on that, just from being impacted so much by public engagement and engaging our students.
That's fantastic. I also wanted to open up Caitlin's question to anyone else on the panel. What have been the benefits or positive feedback you've gotten from your employers about your participation in these programs?
Well, I can't really say that it was my employer, but I was just called by my advisor yesterday. He was asking me to talk to his class of students over at UCR. And we had to switch dates. We had a conflict. But the thing that struck me from that conversation was, well, I've been looking and there's nobody else that has been doing science communication and plant research. And so it's going to be difficult to find another person. Let's try to find a different date. And so I knew that when I was going into the AAAS Mass Media Fellowship. But here we are 2 years later, and this is something that is not as common, at least in doing plant research. So it was, at that time, there was no group at UCR that was focusing on science communication, but I think that it was badly needed, so much so that the group is still there. So I take it as a good and positive sign that even when it's not your direct employer, campuses are looking for science communicators that are also working in science.
Yep, and just double down on what Jen said. It's honestly, it's been a huge recruitment benefits for like my current organization, people looking to grow and develop in a space, and also just in our ability to take the lessons learned from how we communicate, how we engage, and applying that to every level of the organization to make sure we're like creating a scaffold where it's possible for people to grow from a space. And we learned that through mentoring. We learned that through coaching. We learned that through communication. So there's just a million benefits to it. And, personally, my organization is all for it. I'm here now. They're like, get out there and do whatever you need to do. And if that's mentoring or if that's engaging this way, they are all about it.
I also just wanted to add that particularly with the If Then Ambassadors program, these women have been highlighted in so many amazing places. If you aren't familiar, at the summit, each of them were scanned in a 3D printer, and we recently had life-size 3D statues of each of our ambassadors made, and they were featured at the Smithsonian for all of March. I think you can actually see the mini version of the statue behind Nicole on her desk. And so having these programs And the visibility with these programs, it really allowed for positive press for home institutions as well, saying, look at our professors, our academics, our students being featured with statues in the Smithsonian. Look at all of these amazing things that our faculty and affiliates are doing.
Yeah, and I just put in the chat, I like to share this wherever I can, this toolkit for making the case for public engagement in a variety of different ways. So that's from the Society Civic Science Initiative. So check that out. So another question, how could your home institution, kind of related to what we were talking about, have done more to better support you during this program or afterward?
I'll chime in again. Yeah, so I think it was great during the actual program when I was in the cohort, but then afterwards, after we did the the op-ed pieces, like it's hard to sustain the activity once we did it, and then they're like, okay, we're done. So you always have to kind of continue to communicate with leadership and try to build in these things. And so now also another thing that we're doing is trying to support our women faculty through funding, right? So trying to get external funding, and which is what many of you in the audience were interested in, working on a grant now. So we're working on an NSF advanced grant for our women in STEM faculty. So that also started, engagement with my community in my institution, so that we can say, okay, we need to support our women faculty. There are very few of us actually in the engineering school, and we want to be able to increase the numbers so that we see parity in terms of our women and underrepresented folks in STEM. So I think that's also becomes something that we try to find resources to kind of help also get leadership to continue on in that pathway. And there's many types of resources like that that exist.
Anyone else on that one?
All right. Thank you. I will remind the audience that you are welcome to put questions in the chat, as Caitlin did. If you would like to ask a question directly, you can also use the raise your hand reaction and we will call on you. We want to make sure that this session is meeting your needs as well. But in lieu of other questions, I wanted to move a little bit into evaluation. And Chris, I'd like to get your perspective on this too, as I know you've been thinking about the if-then initiative and how you evaluate this. So how do we evaluate these types of programs so that we can be mindful of our participants' time and perspectives without being too much, but still get the information and the feedback that we need to move forward?
I rely on you, Kristen. No, because you're so good. No, I would say though, I say that tongue in cheek. The partnership with AAAS was imperative in this initiative. Had we not had AAAS, the relationship with the ambassadors would have been completely different. So thank goodness for that. And there was regular communication between AAAS and the ambassadors. So I do think when it came time to evaluating, which included for us a sort of a early on the first summit we referenced, we called it a mid ambassadorship, or partway through the 2-year ambassadorship survey, and then a final. And we were very grateful to get the feedback that we got. And in large part, it was, what would we do? What could you use, or what would benefit you in the next iteration of if then? And frankly, we aren't sure what that looks like for us, other than at this point to leverage the relationships we've made with other partners. We call them coalition members. And so organizations that are either within the STEM field or aligned with our mission of diversifying and changing representation at decision-making tables. So we work in media and entertainment, but But that said, to evaluate the effectiveness is really relied heavily on one-on-one engagement. We were fortunate, the exhibit that Kristen referenced at the Smithsonian was in March, and we had 90 some odd ambassadors of the 120 statues represented attend in person. And that was, again, to your point about being in person and seeing each other, it was invaluable to just have the quick conversation about what do you need? What do you need in your role as the CEO of an aquarium or the founder of a nonprofit STEM K-12 program? And I think a lot of it's, from a practical sense for us, it would have been financial and possibly offering other grants. But to replicate the synergy that Nicole referenced is a tough one to shoot for. So I think for the short term, we're focused on supporting the ambassador alum that we have now.
Thank you. And from the participant perspective, how do you want to give feedback? How do you like giving feedback? What works for you all in terms of looking at these programs as a whole? Do you never want to hear from us again?
Yeah, actually, I do think that AAAS did a really good job balancing that and giving us options. So yeah, there were surveys. They weren't surveys every day. That's a good thing because we're busy. But like office hours were a really big deal. I certainly know that people were used to me with office hours, like when I have a question, because we can't always keep up with our email. We can't always keep up with Slack. It's like so many different ways to communicate. And so what I very much enjoyed with engagement and then, continuing that was we had like weekly updates. I felt like that was probably the most effective thing possible. I understood what was happening with all the other ambassadors at any given moment. I understood the initiatives that we were pursuing. I understood like the critical things that I needed to like absolutely pay attention to because that's the world that I live in the middle of meetings. But then also, like I said, the surveys weren't particularly, problematic. They came on a regular basis. They weren't too much to ask. And, ensuring that office hours were open and that Slack was available so that we could directly engage with the AAAS team. That was everything.
I should also say that and echo what Nicole just mentioned in terms of the surveys. I think that the surveys were both so well designed that it doesn't really hurt like taking a survey, even if it's just like 15 questions, because you also realize that this will help another cohort of fellows. And so it was worth all the time spent on the surveys. And we also had like these little groups for regular check-ins with Kristen. And so I heard my other fellows speak about their experiences, and I also shared some of mine as well from time to time. But the surveys were just really, really great because you're engaged with a program.
Yeah, I've nothing to add. I think the surveys are fine. And I think, as a researcher, I think we need to get feedback and understand what's going on. You're testing a hypothesis. Is this important? So I'm happy to do surveys for that.
Okay. So is there anything that these programs that you wish that they could have helped you with, or perhaps that something you wouldn't have expected them to, but that you wish there was out there to help you with your engagement or communication work? And also, maybe I'll put a parallel question to Chris if you want to think about this that's somewhat similar. What would you be looking for in future programs that support scientists and public engagement?
As I think about this, I think one important thing that may not be existing is to understand kind of administration, how to interact with, for example, university administration on these specifically. The onus came on us, but maybe there are already some pathways that exist that would be useful for us to know ahead of times as we try to engage with the institution. So yeah, that's just one idea.
Yes, and I'm not going to directly answer your question, Alana, sorry, but one of the things I was considering as you're talking about engagement, public engagement, that might be unique to us, and I'd love to hear feedback from the participants, but one thing that we've spent a lot of time focusing on, because one of our target audiences, I guess, are young people who we'd like to inspire to pursue STEM or consider STEM, is social media. And I know, Jen, you mentioned your LinkedIn and Twitter aptitude has skyrocketed.
Yeah.
and I'm still very uncomfortable with that, but yet I feel like that's a real platform for change. And I don't know if that's, I know that's your opinion, but what about did you just pick it up? Was there training?
It's training. So that's why I learned about this. Like, if there wasn't, I think I would be still not even participating in it. And I think it's so important too, because the next generation is far ahead of us in terms of this. I have 2 young daughters. One is now 12. And so there's TikTok, there's Instagram, there's all these other kind of media that these young people are so engaged in. And if we can just, participate in that, and they can just see that this is something exciting, I think that would make the world, and I think that's how you can inspire the next generation to be in that, the medium that the young folk are using. So I'm super grateful about that. And I'm also grateful that I know it for my daughter as I'm interacting with her as well. So I think it's been tremendous. That to me has made a big deal. And it is super important for recruitment, for PhD recruitment, for student recruitment. I mean, they're already on this media. And it was super useful during the pandemic as well, because we couldn't even do open house usually we do an open house where students come in at the institution, and we couldn't do that. So then we started to use these platforms to engage with our students and use Zoom and use kind of these interactive ways and think out of the box, especially during this pandemic. So I'm grateful for that. And
it sounds like, Jen, from yours, I was just reading the question in the chat. So the value for you was the ability to engage with a different generation.
Definitely.
And which I would think speaks to recruitment when you're looking at a department looking to recruit new grad students or undergrad, even for that matter. The ability to engage with that age is a key.
Yep. Yes, that's right.
This has been a wonderfully enlightening experience. I see we are quickly running out of time. So first, I wanted to thank you to all of our panelists representing our 3 different programs here today. Hearing your perspectives as both the people who run these programs is very helpful, and I hope that it has been helpful for our audience as well. And to our participants, thank you so much for coming and sharing your thoughts with us and coming to learn a little bit more about what our fellows and ambassadors have been doing. If there are any last statements that any of our panelists would like to make, or Alana, if you had any final words, otherwise, thank you so much for attending, everybody.